Today, we're going to put on our inspector hats. We're diving into the world of hot-dip galvanized steel to figure out why some finishes look shiny, why some look dull, and most importantly, which ones are actually protecting the steel from rust.
Okay, so let's start with a classic example. Take a look at these two. On the left, you've got that bright, shiny, almost chrome-like finish. And on the right, it's a much duller, matte gray. If you had to put your money on it, which one do you think is offering better protection?
You know, your gut probably tells you to go with the shiny one, right? It just looks better. But as we're about to see, when it comes to galvanized steel, you really can't judge a coating by its cover.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to follow the steel's journey, from its basic chemistry through the whole galvanizing process to how it's fabricated, and even what happens to it in storage. Let's get into it. First up, we're looking at issues that are literally part of the steel's DNA before it even gets near a galvanizing kettle. And it really all boils down to two little elements, silicon and phosphorus.
You've probably seen this a million times on things like guardrails or structural beams. It's that consistent, flat, matte gray finish. And because it's not shiny, a lot of people look at it and think, uh-oh, something's wrong here.
But here's the science behind it. See, steels that have a bit more silicon in them are way more reactive when they hit that hot zinc. This reaction makes the super tough zinc-iron alloy layers, which normally stay hidden deep inside the coating, grow all the way out to the surface, basically eating up the shiny, pure zinc layer on top.
And this quote just nails it. The dull look is not a defect. In fact, these matte gray coatings are often thicker and tougher than their shiny cousins, which means they can actually protect the steel for even longer. It's a classic case of brawn over beauty. Okay, here's another one you might come across. See those thin, parallel lines on the surface? They're called striations. They can look a little odd, almost like faint stretch marks on the steel. So what causes this pattern? It all goes back to how the steel was made, specifically from stresses during the rolling process. Whether you see these straight lines called striations or a sort of V-shaped pattern known as fishboning, here's the bottom line. It has absolutely zero effect on how well the steel is protected from corrosion. It's a purely cosmetic thing, so it's totally acceptable.
Now let's switch gears and look at something that is a real problem. This right here is called flaking. You can literally see the coating just peeling away from the steel like old paint.
This happens when that same reactive steel we talked about builds up a coating that's just way too thick. It becomes so brittle that any little bump or flex causes it to lose its grip and just pop right off. So, unlike that dull gray finish, this is a true failure of the coating, and it's a definite cause for rejection.
All right, let's move on to our next category. What can go wrong during the actual dip in the molten zinc? These are the kinds of issues that pop up because of the technique and conditions right there in the galvanizing plant.
I'm sure you've seen these before, those thick, frozen drips and runs of zinc, usually on the edges of a part. This is a classic drainage problem. As the steel is pulled out of the kettle, all that extra molten zinc is supposed to drain off smoothly.
Now, while some lumpy runs are just extra zinc, the real problem is those sharp points, or drainage spikes. They are a serious safety hazard for anyone who has to handle the material later on. And for that reason, those spikes absolutely have to be filed down and removed, no exceptions.
Another process issue is something called dross inclusions. Now, the easiest way to think about dross is to imagine it as a bunch of sandy sediment that settles at the bottom of the zinc kettle. If a part gets dipped too deep or the zinc gets stirred up, these gritty little particles can get stuck in the coating, making it feel rough, almost like sandpaper. A few small bumps are fine, but big, lumpy patches can be a problem and will need to be smoothed out.
Okay, now for a really interesting category. These are defects that aren't the galvanizer's fault at all. They actually start with the person who designed or built the steel part in the first place. It's all about designing for the dip. And this one is pretty dramatic. See that ugly bare spot right around the weld? That's called a welding blowout, and it's a perfect example of a defect that starts back in the fabrication shop. So what's happening here is just some pretty intense physics. A tiny little pinhole in a weld that wasn't sealed properly can trap cleaning fluids inside. Then, when the part is plunged into that 450-degree zinc, the trapped liquid instantly and violently flashes into steam. That steam has to go somewhere, so it blows out, blasting the zinc away and leaving a bare, unprotected spot that has to be repaired. Now, this might look kind of similar, but trust me, it's a totally different animal. This is called a weeping weld. You get these ugly rust-colored stains that seem to bleed out of the joint, sometimes weeks or months after galvanizing. And here's the crucial difference. A blowout leaves bare steel,
which means no corrosion protection. That's a defect the galvanizer has to fix. But a weeping weld is just a cosmetic stain. It's caused by cleaning fluids that were trapped and are now slowly leaking out. It looks bad, but it doesn't actually harm the coating. So it's considered a fabrication issue, not the galvanizer's problem.
So, you'd think after all that, a perfectly galvanized part would be in the clear, but it's not out of the woods yet. The final hurdles are how it's handled, shipped, and stored.
Ah, yes. You've probably seen this before, especially on parts that have been stacked tightly together. This is wet storage stain, but most people just call it white rust. It's basically the zinc coating itself starting to corrode.
But here's the good news, it's almost totally preventable. The rules couldn't be simpler. Keep it dry and give it air. If you take freshly galvanized steel and stack it tight while it's still damp or in a humid place, you're trapping moisture without letting air get to it. And that is the perfect recipe for white rust to form.
So we've gone through the whole journey, from the steel's chemistry to how it's stored. Let's wrap this all up with a clear verdict on what's a real problem and what's just, well, what's just looks.
Think of this as your inspector's cheat sheet. On the left, you've got the aesthetic stuff, the dull grief finish, the mottling, the stripes. They might not be pretty, but they're generally acceptable because the corrosion protection is still there. On the right, you have the deal breakers, the flaking, the bare spots, those dangerous spikes. These are real functional failures that absolutely must be fixed.
So the next time you see a piece of galvanized steel, hopefully you'll remember, the toughest, hardest working coating might just be the one that isn't the prettiest. It's the science underneath that really counts.